We're quite often asked how you can combine pension funds to buy a larger commercial property within your pension. So there's really two options here. If you're looking at SIPPs, then it's quite easy to use multiple SIPPs to purchase a commercial property. What you need to be sure of is it isn't a SIPP with multiple members. It is multiple SIPPs and they each own a part of the property. This can be done different ways in different companies, so the different SIPP providers will offer different options. But quite often what happens is the property itself is purchased by a nominee under trust, and that holds the property, pays the rent gets paid to it, and it will pay it out to the individual SIPPs, and it will deal with anything like that, any of the incoming and outgoing costs. You can also, if you're using the nominee structure, you can actually have a third party or a fourth party even involved in that. So it could be the member themselves directly rather than another SIPP. It could be a SIPP with another company. It could be the company themselves. It could be some completely independent third party. So because it's all owned by this nominee, then you don't have to have an issue of if people move in and out of ownership of this property, because the actual ownership itself doesn't change. What you'll have is details in the trust that says who owns what. So that's quite clean. It does sometimes cost a little bit more to make sure that it all works, but it does work. Some SIPP providers can actually just hold the property directly themselves, and they let you invest into it. So that's a different way of doing it. But in that case, all the SIPPs would need to be with the same SIPP provider, and all the SIPPs, it could only be SIPPs that would be investing within that. The other thing we look at is a SAS. SASs can work very well. The one thing to bear in mind, the difference between the SIPPs and the SASs, is it's one big pot. So the SAS itself and the SAS trustees will buy the property. So the property will be owned by the SAS in the name of the SAS trustees. Depending on how many trustees are involved, this might involve a lot of signing, but it is something that works. When we're looking at borrowing, the difference between the SIPPs and the SASs here is the SIPPs would each be borrowing up to 50% of their own value, whereas the SAS you could borrow up to 50% of the whole pot. So it can make it a little simpler. So there's only one agreement if you're looking at a SAS, where the SIPP you could end up with multiple borrowing agreements and multiple borrowing costs. It doesn't necessarily mean one's right and one's wrong, it just needs to work out which is appropriate for the actual group of investors involved. It should be clear that within the SAS, each member will still own a proportion of the SAS. They won't necessarily own a proportion of the actual property itself, but they will own a proportion of the fund as a whole. So that means a proportion of the borrowing and a proportion of the property and a proportion of the investments will all be allocated to them, just notionally, rather than actually physically got their name on it. So joint property purchase can work really well, so that you can buy larger properties with smaller funds. You can borrow and change ownership generally relatively simply, all without having too much cost and hassle and involving too many solicitors. So it's something that can be done. If you need to talk to us about it, we're more than happy to discuss it, or go to the SIPP provider that you use and they'll be able to talk through the way they do it. As I said, it differs depending on the scheme and the administrator. So it is an option, but you need to check out who's doing what.